They say the cruelest betrayals are not the ones that explode in anger, but the ones that unfold in silence, behind polite smiles and perfect family photos. Across America, you can find 1,000 stories of forgotten parents of sons and daughters who trade love for image, who cut away the roots that raised them. But this story is different. It is the story of a mother erased from her own family's picture, and how she decided to erase them back. It begins in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, North Carolina. A quiet piece of land, wrapped in fog and years. Ruth Sato, 70 years old, lives alone in the house she and her husband built from timber they cut themselves. She spent her life harvesting mushrooms, fixing fences, and keeping alive the soil that kept her family fed. Since her husband passed, her only joy has been the rare visits from her son Ken and the sound of her baby grandson's laughter through a phone. That morning, while sunlight crawled across the kitchen floor, Ruth's phone buzzed. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked. A single photograph filled the screen so bright it almost hurt to stare. White silk tablecloths, crystal glasses glinting under chandeliers, rows of golden place cards arranged in perfect symmetry, and in the center, a birthday cake tall as her arm, topped with a shiny number, 1. The caption read, "Ethan's first birthday. Her grandson. Her blah." Her invitation missing. Then, a second message appeared. Short, cold. "Seating is tight this year. Just send your love." For a few seconds, Ruth didn't move. The house around her held its breath. Outside, the wind pressed against the barn walls, like it wanted to come inside and listen. On the counter, a glass jar of homemade soy sauce waited the gift she'd prepared for weeks. Beside it lay a tiny gold locket she'd bought for Ethan, engraved with a star no bigger than a seed. Both gifts sat in silence, untouched. Ruth picked up the locket. It was warm from the morning sun, but the warmth didn't reach her heart. In its reflection, she saw a woman with soil under her nails and a face that had worked too hard for too long, a mother who had given everything and who now stood outside her own life, watching. She tried to imagine the hotel ballroom from the photo, the perfume of strangers, the hum of the air conditioner, the laughter of guests who had never known the smell of dirt. And somewhere in that perfect room, her son Ken, the same boy who once promised her he'd never forget where he came from. But promises are fragile things, especially when pride and marriage get in the way. Ruth's daughter-in-law, Melissa, had always made her feelings clear. "Your farm smell clings to everything," she once said, smiling as if it were a joke. Now Ruth understood. It wasn't about seating, it was about shame. She zoomed in on the photo again. At the edge of the frame, she spotted an empty chair beside the baby's high seat untouched, waiting. For a second, her heart dared to hope. Maybe that chair was meant for her. But deep down, she knew. That chair had never existed. The kitchen clock ticked loud against the silence. The kettle began to hiss, a sharp whisper that sounded too much like grief. She turned off the stove and leaned against the counter. 70 years old, and still learning what it means to be invisible. Outside, the last leaves let go of their branches. They fell slowly, peacefully, like surrender. But Ruth wasn't ready to surrender. Something inside her shifted, small but solid, like a door beginning to unlock. If they would not see her as family, she would make sure they'd never forget her as a memory. She didn't know what she was going to do yet, only that she would not disappear quietly. Because when love is denied, memory turns to fire. And Ruth Sato's memory burned bright enough to leave scars. So stay with this story, because what happened after that one photograph will reveal secrets most families would bury forever. The phone buzzed again. Ruth looked down. The name glowed on the screen. Ken. She hesitated, heart pounding. Then she answered. But the voice on the other end wasn't her son's. It was a woman's voice, calm, careful, and cold. "Mrs. Sato," the voice said. "This is Melissa." A pause. "I think it's better if you don't come." Ruth's hand trembled. Behind her, the soy jar cracked against the counter, and something deep inside her broke with it. The bus rattled through the foothills, its windows trembling with every turn. Ruth sat by the window, hands folded over the jar in her lap, the locket tucked into her coat pocket. The air smelled faintly of diesel and rain-soaked leaves. Outside, the world passed by in streaks of gray and gold tobacco fields, rusted mailboxes, churchyards with their crooked white crosses. She wasn't sure what she expected to find at her son's house. An apology? A misunderstanding? Or maybe just the proof she needed that the distance between them was no accident. When the bus stopped at the edge of town, she stepped off and walked the last half-mile down a road lined with maples. Their roots had cracked the sidewalk like they were trying to escape. At the end of the street stood Ken's new home, modern, clean, made of glass and stone. It looked more like a showroom than a place to live. Her own reflection wavered in the window before she knocked. Melissa opened the door. Her smile was as polished as the brass handle she held. "Oh," she said, surprised but not exactly pleased. "You came all this way." Her eyes darted to the jar in Ruth's hands. "I brought some soy," Ruth said quietly. "And a little something for Ethan." Melissa's perfume drifted into the air, sweet and heavy, meant to cover everything. "Could you," she gestured delicately, waving a manicured hand near her nose, "maybe take your coat off outside first? The farm smell tends to linger." The words were soft, but they landed hard. That same word again, linger. Like her presence was a stain. Ruth's grip tightened around the jar. She forced a smile. "I came straight from work. Sorry if I'm not polished enough." Melissa tilted her head, voice honeyed but hollow. "Oh no, it's just Ken has asthma, you know. We try to keep the air clean." Ruth looked past her into the living room. White walls, pale wood floors, a vase of roses that didn't smell like anything real. She saw her son sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "Ken!" she called softly. He looked up, startled. For a second, something flickered guilt, maybe, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Mom," he said, standing, "you didn't have to come all this way." Ruth's throat tightened. "You didn't invite me. I thought I'd invite myself." He rubbed the back of his neck. "It's just, the hotel's really formal. Melissa's parents are paying for everything. Seating's complicated." "Complicated?" Ruth said, her voice quieter now but sharper. "You mean there's no room for your mother?" He looked away. "Don't make this harder than it is." Behind him, Melissa crossed her arms. "It's about presentation, Mrs. Sato. The concept is elegant simplicity. We're trying to keep things cohesive." "The concept," Ruth repeated slowly. "And I don't fit your concept." Melissa's smile didn't waver. "It's not personal." But of course, it was. Ruth stepped back, her shoes leaving damp marks on the spotless tile. She placed the jar on the entryway table. "This is for you," she said. "Homemade soy, your favorite." Ken nodded awkwardly but didn't move to touch it. Melissa leaned closer, her voice dropping. "You really didn't have to trouble yourself. Everything's already taken care of." Ruth nodded once. "Yes, I see that." The air felt tight, like the whole house was holding its breath. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small gold locket. "And this," she said softly, "for Ethan." Melissa glanced at it, then gave a polite laugh. "Oh, that's sweet, but we already bought him a designer bracelet from Tiffany. Maybe just keep that for now." The words struck harder than any slap. Ruth looked down at the locket in her palm. It glinted faintly under the hallway light, small and meaningless to everyone but her. She nodded again, slow and deliberate. "Of course." Without another word, she turned toward the door. Her reflection passed across the glass wall, warping slightly, like even the house refused to show her clearly. Outside, the wind carried the faint smell of wet earth. It followed her down the steps, clinging to her coat the way memories cling to the living. When she reached the bus stop again, the bench was slick with rain. She sat anyway. The jar in her bag thumped softly against the metal frame with every tremor of her hands. Across the street, a family walked past parents laughing, a child lifted high on his father's shoulders. The laughter pierced her like sunlight through water, bright, beautiful, unreachable. She stared down at her phone. The same photo glowed on the screen, mocking her with its perfect symmetry. She zoomed in until the image blurred into color and light. At the very edge of the frame, she could almost see herself. a ghost at the threshold of someone else's happiness. She wanted to cry, but the tears refused. Her grief had dried into something harder. 3 days later, she went to the Saturday market to buy mushrooms. The air smelled of coffee and rain-soaked straw. An old neighbor, Mr. Parker, spotted her near the produce stand. "Ruth," he said cheerfully, "I heard Ken's throwing a big hotel party for the baby this weekend. Must be exciting, huh?" Ruth froze. Her fingers tightened around the bag of mushrooms. "There's no seat for me," she said quietly. Mr. Parker frowned. "Really? That can't be right. I heard they rented half the ballroom." The words struck like ice. She forced a smile, but her lips trembled. "Guess they filled it with more important people." She walked home in silence. That night, as the fields turned gold under the setting sun, she stood at her kitchen window and whispered to her husband's photograph on the wall. "Tom, they said there's no place for me. Not even one chair." The photo smiled back, silent and kind, as if waiting for her to understand something she wasn't ready to admit. By the time the moon rose, Ruth had made her decision. If they would not give her a seat, she would show up anyway. Because a grandmother doesn't need permission to love her grandchild. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can give an old woman is a reason to prove she still matters. At dawn, Ruth began sewing the old hem of her best dress. In the corner of the table sat the locket, gleaming faintly in the dark. She looked at it once and whispered, "They'll see me, even if it's the last thing they ever do." The next morning, the house was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones, not from weather but from quiet. Ruth stood at the kitchen table, scissors in hand, cutting loose threads from a faded indigo dress she hadn't worn in years. It wasn't fancy, just a plain, old-fashioned thing her husband once said made her look like a summer storm. She had worn it to weddings, to funerals, to her son's college graduation. And now, she would wear it to something in between her own disappearance or her rebirth. The fabric whispered under her fingers, each stitch a pulse of memory. In the corner, the jar of soy still sat untouched. A spider had spun a fine thread across its lid overnight. Ruth brushed it away, whispering to herself, "Not yet, not until they see me." The clock on the wall ticked with heavy precision. It was Tuesday. The party would be on Saturday, 11 o'clock in the morning, at the Grand Haven Hotel downtown. She knew because she had searched for it online, typed Ethan Sato birthday into the event listings. And there it was, glowing back at her in digital print. Her son's family name, her grandson's face, her own existence nowhere to be found. She closed the laptop lid. Her reflection stared back, faint and ghostly in the glossy screen. There was a part of her that wanted to call, to say, "I'll stay home. I understand." But there was another part, older, deeper, that refused to let this story end with silence. She pulled out a small notebook and began to write a list. It was simple. Clean the dress. Fix the hair tie. Bring the locket. Bring flowers. Look them in the eye. By noon, the plan was no longer a whisper. It had become her heartbeat. That afternoon, Ruth walked down to the local florist, a little shop that smelled of lilies and dust. The owner, Mrs. Hall, looked up from the counter. "Ruth, you don't come into town much these days." Ruth smiled gently. "I'm going to a celebration." "Oh?" Mrs. Hall said, brightening. "For who?" "My grandson," Ruth replied. "He just turned 1. Mrs. Hall clapped her hands together. "Oh, how wonderful. What kind of bouquet would you like?" Ruth paused, looking at the rows of flowers, sunflowers with their open, defiant faces, chrysanthemums, heavy with patience, roses that pretended to be perfect. Finally, she pointed to the marigolds and wild daisies. "These," she said, "and wrap them in something gold." When Mrs. Hall handed her the bouquet, Ruth pressed it gently to her chest. It smelled of soil and sun home itself, perfect for a child who'd never known either. She paid in cash, smiled, and said, "Make it beautiful. It'll be the last gift I ever give them." That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the wind ripple through the fields. The stars above her farm looked sharper than usual, like nails on black glass. Somewhere in the distance, a train moved through the valley, its horn long and mournful. She imagined the hotel again, the chandeliers, the laughter, the coldness that hid behind good manners. She imagined Melissa's face when she walked in uninvited, holding the bouquet. Would she flinch, smile, pretend surprise? Ruth didn't care. She just wanted to see her grandson's eyes once. That would be enough. By Thursday, the old indigo dress was hanging by the stove, pressed and ready. She'd mended the hem, replaced the buttons, and fixed the worn sash. Her husband's photograph stood on the mantel, watching her. "Tom," she murmured, "they'll finally see who raised that boy." She opened a small wooden box beside the photo. Inside were her husband's savings bonds, folded and yellow with age. Enough for one bus ticket, one hotel night, and a new start if she needed it. She traced his handwriting on the paper. "For Ruth, when you decide to live again." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she smiled through it. Maybe this was what he meant. Maybe living again didn't always mean peace. Sometimes it meant war. Friday morning, she went to the bank. The teller smiled politely. "How much would you like to withdraw today, Mrs. Sato?" Ruth's answer was steady. "Everything I need to be remembered." That evening, she laid everything out on her kitchen table. The bouquet, now drying slightly at the edges, the locket, polished until it caught even the smallest light, and her bus ticket to Charlotte, tucked inside an envelope with trembling handwriting, "For Ethan." She sat for a long time, just staring. She wasn't angry anymore, not in the way people understood anger. This was colder, quieter, like water that had frozen over a wound so deep it could no longer bleed. When the clock struck midnight, Ruth turned off the lights. The house sank into silence, the kind that remembers everything. Tomorrow, she thought, they would finally see her. Not the version they tried to hide behind concepts and aesthetics, but the woman who gave them life and could take it back in ways they didn't yet understand. As dawn crept in, Ruth stood in front of the mirror wearing her indigo dress. In her reflection, the locket glowed faintly against her chest, a single spark in the early morning light. She whispered to the empty house, "If I'm not human enough for their table, then let's see how they handle a ghost." The morning sun climbed slow over the Carolina hills, turning the mist to gold. Ruth stepped off the city bus and into another world. The Grand Haven Hotel stood before her like something carved out of light, a palace of glass and marble, every surface polished to forget the people who'd built it. Valets in black suits whisked cars away. Guests in pressed dresses glided through the revolving doors, as if the air itself bowed to them. Ruth adjusted the strap of her small bag and held her bouquet close. The gold wrapping shimmered against her old indigo dress. It looked out of place, a patch of sunlight in a world that preferred silver. Inside, the lobby was enormous. Cool air rushed over her skin. The scent of lilies and expensive perfume filled the space. Every sound, heels, laughter, distant piano, felt like it belonged to someone else's story. A chandelier hung from the ceiling like a frozen storm. Beneath it, the hotel's marble floor shone so bright she could see her reflection small, wrinkled, standing between two worlds. She approached the reception desk. The young man behind it smiled with professional warmth. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" Ruth lifted her chin. "I'm here for a private event, the Sato family, Ethan's first birthday." He typed quickly, eyes scanning the tablet. "Of course. May I have your name?" "Ruth Sato," she said. Her voice didn't waver. The man hesitated. "One moment, please." His smile dimmed slightly as he scrolled. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't see your name on the guest list." Ruth felt her stomach twist, but she kept her face still. "Check again." He nodded politely, retyping, searching once more. The pause was long enough for her to hear the piano stop, a note hanging unfinished in the air. Finally, he looked up, gentle but firm. "I'm afraid you're not listed as an attendee, ma'am." Ruth managed a small smile. "My son, Ken Sato, arranged this event. His wife is Melissa." He tapped his earpiece. "Yes, I see. Let me confirm with the organizer." As he turned away, Ruth's eyes wandered toward the far wall and froze. There, on a massive digital screen, ran a slideshow. Photos of Ethan, her grandson. One picture showed him in a white tuxedo bib, reaching for a candle. Another, his small hand gripping Ken's finger. And then a group shot Melissa's family smiling around the baby, their faces lit with pride and camera flash. No sign of Ruth, not even in the background. She was invisible as if she had never existed. The clerk returned, still polite. "Mrs. Sato, I spoke with the event coordinator. They said seating is full, but they'll let your family know you're here." Ruth nodded slowly. "Thank you." He gestured to a waiting area by the window. "You're welcome to sit while we sort this out." She took a seat on the edge of a leather sofa. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the bouquet. The flowers still smelled like the field she'd picked them from, raw, honest, alive. In the sterile air of the lobby, that scent felt almost rebellious. Across the room, guests arrived in waves. Polished shoes, tailored suits, laughter too loud to be real. Ruth saw Melissa before she heard her. The woman was radiant, pearls at her throat, a flowing cream dress that glimmered under the chandelier. Her hair caught the light like spun gold. People turned when she passed. She was the image of perfection. Then her eyes found Ruth. For a brief second, her smile cracked. Then she approached, heels clicking sharp against marble. "Mrs. Sato," she said, her voice wrapped in sweetness and control. "You didn't tell us you were coming." Ruth rose, holding the bouquet like a shield. "I wanted to see Ethan. Just for a moment." Melissa's gaze flickered toward the flowers. "Oh, how thoughtful. But we already have arrangements. Hydrangeas, lilies, orchids all white to match the theme. These—" She paused, searching for a word that sounded polite enough. "These feel a little rustic." Ruth smiled faintly. "They smell like home." "Yes," Melissa said, her tone tightening. "That's exactly the issue. The concept is elegant minimalism. We're trying to avoid earthy tones." Ruth tilted her head. "You mean dirt?" Melissa's lips curved, but her eyes hardened. "You always take things so personally." "Because they are personal," Ruth said quietly. "Family usually is." For a heartbeat, silence hung between them. Then Melissa sighed. "Let me talk to Ken. Maybe we can figure something out." She turned and walked toward the elevator. Her perfume lingered long after she was gone, sweet, suffocating, artificial. Ruth sat back down, staring at the bouquet. She thought of all the hours she had spent growing the mushrooms her son once sold to pay his college tuition. The years of dirt under her nails, the nights without rest. And now, the same hands that had lifted him up were no longer good enough to touch his world. The elevator dinged. 2 guests stepped out laughing, holding gifts wrapped in gold paper. The man turned and said, "Can you believe the size of that ballroom? There's room for 50 people in there." Ruth's chest tightened. 50. "Seating's tight," he'd said. She looked down at the bouquet again. One marigold petal had fallen onto her lap. She picked it up gently and held it between her fingers until it crumbled. Minutes passed. No one came for her. At last, she stood, smoothing her dress. The flowers trembled slightly in her hands. She walked to the front desk again. "I'll deliver these myself," she said softly. The young clerk looked nervous. "Ma'am, I really shouldn't—" But she was already moving. The click of her shoes echoed across the marble. Every step felt heavier, but also freer. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the sound of her heels. She pressed the elevator button. The silver doors opened with a soft hiss. As she stepped in, her reflection caught in the polished steel. For a moment, she didn't see an old woman. She saw something else, something that had survived storms, loss, and the slow erosion of love. Something unstoppable. The doors began to close. Just before they did, the clerk's voice called out behind her. "Ma'am, wait, they just told me—" But it was too late. The doors sealed shut, trapping his voice outside. Ruth stood alone in the mirrored box, clutching the bouquet. And as the elevator began to rise, a strange calm spread through her chest. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of rejection, not of shame, not of being unseen. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't asking for a place. She was taking one. The elevator slowed, a soft chime announcing her arrival. The digital display read, "Ballroom, Level 2. Ruth took a deep breath. Somewhere above her, a child laughed. She tightened her grip on the flowers and whispered, "Happy birthday, Ethan." The doors slid open. A burst of golden light spilled in, and waiting at the entrance was her son. The ballroom doors stood open, spilling golden light into the hallway. Music drifted out, soft jazz, expensive, rehearsed. Every detail shimmered, the crystal chandeliers, the ribbon centerpieces, the waiters gliding in white gloves. And in the middle of it all, her son, Ken Zato, dressed in a tailored white suit, hair slicked back, a purple silk handkerchief peeking from his pocket. He looked older, taller, sharper than she remembered, but his shoulders still carried the same uncertain slouch he'd had as a boy. Ruth froze in the doorway, holding her bouquet. For a moment, the sight of him softened her. She remembered the child who used to tug at her apron strings, the boy who called her Ma when thunder scared him. Then she saw his eyes. Ken's smile faltered. "Mom, what are you doing here?" The question wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was the voice of someone caught doing something they knew was wrong and still trying to pretend it was fine. Ruth took one step forward. "I came to wish my grandson a happy birthday." A few guests turned, whispering behind their champagne glasses. Melissa appeared from behind a table, perfect as a magazine cover, her voice syrupy but sharp. "Mrs. Sato, you made it. How unexpected." Ruth's gaze flicked to her son, not Melissa. "You told me there wasn't a seat." Ken looked down at his shoes. "It's just complicated, Mom. There were limits." 50 guests, Ruth said. Her tone was quiet, but it cut through the air. "And not one chair for the woman who raised you." Melissa stepped closer, lowering her voice. "This isn't the place for a scene. We're in the middle of photos. Let's not ruin the mood, all right?" Ruth let out a soft laugh, bitter, almost weightless. "A scene? You mean a truth you can't filter?" The air went still. Somewhere, a waiter pretended to adjust a tray just to avoid looking at her. Ruth looked around the room. "This is beautiful," she said. "You did well. Everything matches. White, silver, quiet. Even your hearts." Melissa's smile froze. "Excuse me? Do you know what happens when you bleach something too long?" Ruth said. "It starts to disappear." Ken flinched. "Mom, please." She turned to him, her voice trembling now. "You think this is about pride, Ken? About showing off to strangers? You think I care about your fancy hotel, your spotless wife, your perfect photos?" He started to speak, but she raised her hand. "I came here for one thing, to see the child who carries our name, to see that he's real." Melissa reached out as if to touch her arm, but Ruth stepped back. "Don't," she said. "You don't get to touch me when you've spent years pretending I don't exist." A hush fell over the room. Only the soft notes of the jazz piano remained, out of place in the tension. Ruth slowly placed the bouquet on the nearest table. The golden paper crinkled under her fingers. "I brought these for Ethan, flowers from my garden. They smell like rain, and they last longer than orchids." Melissa frowned slightly. "They don't match the theme." Ruth smiled. "Good." She turned to leave, but as she reached the door, a man in a black suit blocked her path. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I'm sorry, but this is a private event." The words hung heavy in the air. She looked back once more at her son. He didn't meet her eyes. That hurt worse than anything. Ruth nodded slowly. "I see." Her voice broke on the edges, but she didn't let it fall apart. She straightened her back, her hands trembling around the bouquet's empty stems. "Private event," she repeated. "Of course it is. I suppose family is private too when you decide who counts." For a moment, no one moved. Even the pianist stopped playing. Then Ruth lifted the flowers from the table and turned toward the exit. She walked slowly across the marble floor, each step echoing in the silence. As she passed the concierge desk, she paused beside a tall green trash bin lined with plastic. She stared at it for a long moment. Then, with careful hands, she placed the bouquet inside. Not tossed, not thrown. Placed like an offering to something sacred and cruel. A single marigold petal fluttered down, landing near her shoe. She didn't look back. Outside, the hotel doors slid open with a soft sigh. The air was hot and alive again, the smell of asphalt and wind cutting through the perfume she'd left behind. She walked toward the street, her reflection flickering in the hotel glass one last time. Behind her, The music started again, louder this time, as if trying to erase her silence. A taxi idled by the curb. The driver leaned out. "You need a ride, ma'am?" Ruth nodded. "Yes. Home." She climbed in, her voice calm, almost weightless. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking. As the car pulled away, she looked out the window. The hotel shrank in the distance, swallowed by light and glass. Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. They had denied her a seat, but they had given her something far more powerful, a reason. Ruth reached into her bag. The jar of homemade soy sauce had cracked. Its dark liquid shimmered against the glass like ink. She stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "If they can throw away my love, I can throw away their comfort." The taxi turned toward the highway. In her eyes, something had changed. The softness had burned away. Only resolve remained. The afternoon sun pressed hard on the valley, laying long shadows across the fields. The air smelled of hay, earth, and slow forgiveness, the kind that only nature knows how to give. Ruth stood outside her farmhouse, sleeves rolled to her elbows, turning over a tray of mushrooms drying in the light. She tried not to think of the hotel, of the laughter that had followed her out the door, of Melissa's perfect smile, of her son's silence. But pain has a way of echoing. It clings to the air, the way humidity clings to skin. When she heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel, Ruth already knew who it was. She didn't look up. The car door opened, and 2 pairs of footsteps approached. "Mom." Ken's voice low, cautious, threaded with guilt. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron, still facing the fields. "You remember how to get here then?" "Don't start, please," he said quietly. "We just came to talk." She turned. Melissa stood a step behind him, sunglasses hiding her eyes, her lips pressed tight. "Talk?" Ruth asked. "Or explain why you let me stand in that lobby like a beggar?" Ken winced. "It wasn't supposed to be that way. Melissa..." "Had nothing to do with it?" Ruth cut him off. "You always say that. You always let someone else make the choices for you." Melissa's chin lifted. "Mrs. Sato, you embarrassed us. You showed up uninvited. You made guests uncomfortable." Ruth's laugh came out sharp, brittle. "Uninvited? That's what I am now, isn't it? Uninvited to my own bloodline." "Mom, please," Ken said, lowering his voice. "Neighbors can hear." Ruth's eyes flashed. "Good. Let them." Across the fence, old Mr. Parker paused with his bicycle, pretending to fix his chain. The wind carried every word. "You told me there was no seat," Ruth said, her tone rising. "But there were 50 people in that room. 50. Not one of them my husband. Not one of them me. What were you so ashamed of? The smell of dirt? The woman who built the roof over your head?" Melissa stepped forward, folding her arms. "This isn't about shame. It's about boundaries. You don't understand the world we live in now. Things are curated, professional." "Curated?" Ruth repeated, her voice breaking into a short, bitter laugh. "You curate flowers. You don't curate people." Melissa's smile tightened. "You're being dramatic." "Dramatic?" Ruth took one step closer. "Do you know what dramatic is? Dramatic is a mother watching her son turn his back so his friends won't see who gave him life." Ken's face reddened. "That's not fair." "Fair?" Ruth said, shaking her head. "No, Ken. Fair would have been 1 chair." Silence settled like dust. Melissa finally spoke again, her voice quieter. "You made a scene, Mrs. Sato. You could have just gone home." "I did," Ruth said, "and I realized something while I was there." She turned toward the house, picked up an envelope from the porch table, and held it out. Ken frowned. "What's that?" "Paperwork," Ruth said evenly. "From the county office. I met with a lawyer yesterday." Melissa's face stiffened. "A lawyer? For what?" "For the land," Ruth said. "I'm transferring it, selling it." Ken blinked, confused. "Selling? You can't do that. Dad wanted me to..." "Don't you dare speak for your father," Ruth said sharply. "He told me once in his last year that this land belonged to whoever respected it, and right now the only person who still touches it with their hands is me." Melissa stepped closer, lowering her sunglasses. "You can't be serious. That land is worth a fortune." "I'm aware," Ruth said calmly. I already spoke to a buyer. Ken's voice broke. Mom, please. That land was supposed to stay in the family. Ruth met his eyes, steady. Family? You mean the same family that left me off the list? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Ruth's tone softened, but her words did not. You taught me something that day, Ken. If I'm not treated like family, then I don't owe anyone a legacy. Melissa scoffed. So this is revenge? No, Ruth said. This is balance. For a moment, the only sound was the creak of the windmill turning slowly behind the barn. Then Melissa muttered, You'll regret this. Ruth nodded. Maybe, but at least it'll be my choice, not someone else's. She turned back toward her tray of mushrooms, flipping one over carefully. Her voice dropped low, almost to a whisper. You know, when something rots, people call it decay. Farmers call it transformation. That's how new life starts. Maybe that's what this is. Ken took a hesitant step toward her. Mom, I didn't mean to hurt you. I know, Ruth said. You just forgot who you came from. But don't worry, I'm reminding you. She handed him the envelope again. The sale goes through next week. I'll keep enough for myself. The rest, you'll never touch. Ken's jaw tightened. You're doing this to punish us. Ruth shook her head. No, I'm doing this to protect what's left of me. Melissa's voice trembled. You'll die alone in that house. Ruth turned, her eyes suddenly gentle but unyielding. Alone is better than unseen. The couple stood there for a moment, speechless. Then Ken reached out, almost to touch her arm, but she stepped back. You should go, she said quietly. It's a long drive back to the city, and I've got work to do. They hesitated, then turned toward the car. The gravel crunched under their tires as they drove away. Ruth watched them disappear down the road. Only when the sound of the engine faded did she let out a slow breath. She walked back toward her drying trays, picked up one mushroom, and smiled faintly. The sun was setting behind the ridge, painting the fields in amber and shadow. It was beautiful, and it was hers. As Ruth gathered her things to go inside, a flash of movement caught her eye. A silver sedan had stopped at the end of the dirt road, the same one her son drove. But this time, he wasn't inside. Melissa was. She sat there, engine running, phone pressed to her ear, watching the house. Ruth's heart slowed. She didn't move. She could almost read the words on Melissa's lips. She's selling it, Melissa whispered into the phone. If we don't act fast, that land, everything will be gone. Ruth turned away, the corners of her mouth lifting. They still don't understand, she murmured. It already is. The following morning broke, with a restless wind sweeping through the valley. Clouds drifted low, brushing the hills like ghosts that had forgotten how to leave. Inside the small farmhouse, Ruth sat at the kitchen table, the papers from the county office spread neatly before her. The air smelled of ink, soil, and resolve. Her husband's voice still lingered in the house, not as sound, but as habit, the rhythm of how she folded the dish towel, how she still left space for his coffee cup each morning. She reached into the drawer beside the sink and pulled out an old cassette recorder, scratched and faded but still working. It was the one her husband had used to dictate notes when his lungs began to fail. She pressed play. The tape hissed for a few seconds before his voice emerged low, warm, steady. Ruth, it said, if you're hearing this, it means I couldn't say goodbye the way I wanted. You've spent your whole life holding this family together, and I know you're afraid of what happens when I'm gone. But listen to me. The land is yours, every acre. Don't let anyone use our name to control you. Use it for yourself. Live, even if it means letting go. Ruth sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table. The sound of his voice was a weight and a comfort all at once. She closed her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Outside, a car slowed near the fence. Tires rolled over gravel. Ruth opened her eyes. It was Ken again. And Melissa. She stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress, and met them on the porch. Ken climbed out first, carrying a look that was part anger, part desperation. Mom, he said, we need to talk about the land. I thought we already did, Ruth replied. Melissa stepped out, wearing a crisp blazer, her tone sharp and practiced. "You've made a mistake, Mrs. Sato. Selling that property without consulting us could trigger inheritance tax penalties. It's complicated." Ruth tilted her head. "You sound like the realtor." Melissa's eyes flickered. "I've done my research." Ken stepped forward. "Mom, I get it, okay? You're hurt. But this isn't the way. That land has been in our family for generations. It's supposed to be mine someday. Dad told me—" Ruth raised a hand. "No, he told me." She walked back into the house and returned with the recorder. "You should hear what your father actually said." Ken hesitated, glancing at Melissa. "What's that?" "Proof," Ruth said simply. She pressed play. The tape hissed again, then her husband's voice filled the air between them. "Ruth, if you're hearing this, the land is yours. Don't let anyone use our name to control you. Use it for yourself." The words hung in the doorway like a verdict. Ken's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Melissa's expression hardened, a perfect mask cracking at the edges. Ruth clicked the recorder off. "He trusted me to decide what happens here, and I've decided." Melissa took a step forward, her voice rising. "You're twisting his words. You know he wanted to keep it in the family." Ruth looked straight at her. "You mean your family, the one that couldn't even find me a chair." Ken rubbed his forehead. "Mom, please, this isn't about that party." "Yes, it is," Ruth said, her voice steady. "That party was just the proof. You've both spent years pretending I don't belong in the world you built. Now you'll see what it feels like to lose the ground under your feet." Melissa's patience snapped. "You're being vindictive. You're destroying your own legacy out of spite." Ruth smiled faintly. "No, I'm rewriting it." She held up the signed papers. "The sale is scheduled for Friday morning. The buyer's from out of state, a renewable energy firm. They'll turn the land into solar fields." Ken's voice cracked. "Solar fields? You can't be serious." "Deadly serious," Ruth said. "The land will still make light, just a different kind." Melissa folded her arms, eyes cold. "You think this makes you strong? It just makes you pathetic." Ruth's gaze didn't waver. "Pathetic would have been waiting for your permission." Ken's shoulders slumped. He looked at his mother, really looked at her, the lines in her face, the dirt still caught under her fingernails, the quiet dignity that no amount of polish could mimic. "Mom," he said softly, "what do you want from us?" Ruth's eyes softened, but her voice didn't. "Respect, not apology, not pity, just recognition that I'm still human, that's all." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind brushing through the grass. Then Ruth placed the recorder on the porch railing. "You can keep that," she said. "So next time you forget who you come from, maybe you'll remember whose voice built the ground you're standing on." Melissa reached for Ken's arm. "We're leaving," she said. "She's lost it." They turned back toward the car. Ruth watched them go, her husband's voice still echoing faintly from the recorder. As the car disappeared down the road, she whispered to the wind, "You were right, Tom. Letting go is the only way to live again." She looked out at the hills, the land that had carried her name, her grief, her love. In the fading light, it glowed like memory itself, fragile, stubborn, and free. The next morning, Ruth received a call from the county clerk's office. The sale date had been moved up. Friday, 10 o'clock sharp. She hung up the phone and looked out at the fields. A flock of crows rose suddenly from the trees, dark against the sky. Ruth smiled to herself. "Let them come," she murmured. "It's my turn to make them wait outside." Friday came wrapped in gray clouds. The sky hung low, swollen with rain that refused to fall, the kind of morning that smelled like endings. Ruth rose before dawn. She put on a simple gray sweater, brushed her hair, and slipped the small gold locket into her pocket. Her husband's photo rested by the door, watching her as she left. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as she walked to the end of the drive. Her truck refused to start again, so she didn't bother. She called a taxi instead. When it arrived, the driver looked at her suitcase and the manila folder in her lap. "Moving out?" he asked kindly. Ruth smiled faintly. "In a way." They rode in silence through the narrow road that curved around her land. The fields stretched wide on both sides, a lifetime measured in acres. The morning fog clung to the soil like it couldn't bear to let go. She pressed her palm against the window, whispering under her breath, "Thank you." At 10 o'clock sharp, she stood inside the county office, across from a young man in a navy suit. He was polite, efficient, faceless in the way bureaucrats often are. "Mrs. Sato," he said, adjusting his tie, "we have all the documents prepared. Once you sign, the transaction is final." Ruth nodded. "That's why I'm here." He spread the papers across the table. "Just here, and here." Her hands didn't tremble. She wrote her name carefully, each letter pressed deep into the page, Ruth. The sound of the pen scratching the paper felt like thunder. The lawyer smiled politely. "Congratulations. You've just made a very lucrative sale." Ruth smiled back. "It's not about money, it's about peace." He blinked, unsure how to answer, and began gathering the papers into a folder. As he worked, the office door opened behind her. Footsteps hurried, familiar. "Mom!" Ken's voice. Ruth didn't turn around. "Mom, wait," he said again, breathless. "Don't do this. We can talk. We can figure something out." The lawyer looked up, startled. "Sir, this is a private—" "It's fine," Ruth interrupted softly. "Let him speak." Ken stepped closer. His face was pale, his tie slightly crooked, eyes rimmed red. "Mom, please, don't sell it. That land is our history, it's Dad's legacy." Ruth faced him slowly. "You didn't want legacy when you left me in that lobby." His jaw tightened. "That was a mistake. I know it was wrong, but this is forever." Ruth's voice was calm. "So was your silence." He ran a hand through his hair. "You don't understand. Melissa's parents—" Ruth cut him off. "Melissa's parents don't get to own my life." Behind him, the door opened again. Melissa stepped in, heels clicking against the tile, her perfume flooding the small room. "Mrs. Sato," she said, breathless but composed, "if you do this, you're ruining your son's future." Ruth laughed softly. "I think you ruined it the day you taught him how to forget his mother." Melissa flinched. "That's unfair." "No," Ruth said. "That's truth." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if I could just—" Ruth signed the final page before he could finish. The pen clicked. The deal was done. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft whir of the ceiling fan, pushing the air in tired circles. Ken's voice broke the silence. "You sold our land to strangers?" Ruth turned to him. "No, I sold it to someone who will treat it better than my own blood." Melissa's tone turned sharp. "You'll regret this. That land was worth hundreds of thousands." Ruth raised a hand. "I don't measure worth in dollars. I measure it in how people remember me. And you've already shown me what I'm worth to you." She closed the folder, slipped the check into her bag, and looked at her son one last time. "I'm not angry anymore, Ken. I just finally understand who I am without you." Ken's eyes filled with tears, but Ruth stepped past him gently. She placed a hand on his shoulder, not in comfort but in farewell. "You still have your wife," she said softly. "You still have your name. But remember, a name without roots blows away in the first strong wind." She walked out into the gray daylight. The rain had finally begun to fall, steady and slow. It soaked her sweater, her hair, the papers in her bag, but she didn't care. Outside the office, she paused on the steps. Across the street, two familiar figures waved from a pickup truck. Mrs. Hall, the florist, and old Mr. Parker. They had come to witness it, just like they promised. Mr. Parker grinned. "Well, Ruth, guess it's done, huh?" Ruth nodded, her voice steady. "It's done, and it's mine." The florist handed her a small paper bag. Inside was a single white lily. "For new beginnings," Mrs. Hall said softly. Ruth smiled. "New soil, new life." They stood there in the rain for a while, talking about nothing. The weather, the crops, the sound of thunder far off in the hills. When the truck finally pulled away, Ruth stayed on the steps a moment longer. The check in her pocket was heavy, but the weight on her chest was gone. She looked up at the sky, the first real smile in years touching her lips. "Tom," she whispered, "I did it, I let go." That evening, Ruth returned home to find a letter slipped under her door. Her name written in Melissa's handwriting, sharp, elegant, and trembling. She tore it open. Inside, a single line. "If you sell the rest, you'll never see Ethan again." Ruth stared at the words for a long time. Then she lit the stove, held the letter over the flame, and watched it curl into ash. The wind carried the smoke through the open window. "Good," she whispered. Let it drift back to her. The rain had stopped by dawn. The fields lay still under a pale sky, the soil dark and shining, as if the earth itself had taken a deep breath. Ruth packed light that morning, one suitcase, her husband's photo, and the small gold locket for Ethan. She left the house exactly as it was, dishes washed, curtains half drawn, the scent of soy and rain still floating in the air. By mid-morning, she was standing at the cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. Her husband's gravestone sat beneath an oak tree that had grown thick and strong since the day they buried him. The stone was simple, weathered, unadorned. Ruth brushed away the leaves, her hands slow and deliberate. "I did it, Tom," she whispered. "I sold the land. The farm's going to shine again, just in a different kind of light." She paused, her eyes softening. "You were right. Letting go wasn't dying, it was breathing again." The wind stirred the oak leaves, and she could almost imagine his voice in it, low, patient, proud. She knelt there for a while, the silence thick with both peace and ache. Then a sound broke through it, footsteps on the gravel path. "Ken." He walked slowly toward her, hands in his pockets, the weight of something unsaid hanging on his shoulders. His tie was gone, his shirt open at the collar. He looked less like a man trying to impress the world, and more like the boy who used to run barefoot through the creek. Ruth didn't look up. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. He stopped a few feet behind her. "I needed to be." The air between them trembled. "Melissa's furious," he said finally. "She thinks you're trying to punish us." Ruth kept her eyes on the gravestone. "You think so too?" He hesitated. I don't know what to think anymore." She stood, turning to face him. "You had years to think, Ken. You just used them to avoid the truth." His voice cracked. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We were supposed to build something together." "You did," Ruth said softly. "You just built it on top of me." Ken flinched, looking away. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind hissed softly through the grass, carrying the faint smell of rain and soil. Ruth took the small locket from her pocket and placed it on the grave. "That's for Ethan," she said. "When he's old enough to ask where he comes from, you tell him about this place. Tell him it wasn't bought, it was earned." Ken's throat worked as if he were swallowing a stone. "He'll miss you." Ruth looked at him, really looked. The same eyes she had once seen in her husband's face stared back at her, full of confusion and regret. "He can't miss what he's never been allowed to know," she said quietly. Ken's shoulders sagged. "Melissa's scared," he admitted. "She thinks if you sell everything, she'll lose control. She's afraid of what people will say." Ruth smiled sadly. "People like her always are." "She sent you a letter, didn't she?" Ken asked. Ruth nodded. "I burned it." He looked down. "She doesn't speak for me, Mom." Ruth stepped closer. "Then speak for yourself." His eyes lifted to hers, wet but clear. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the party. For letting her treat you that way. For forgetting who you were." Ruth let out a slow breath, her voice softer now. "I forgave you the moment I saw you walk into that hotel, because I knew the boy I raised was still somewhere in there just hiding behind her rules." Ken took another step forward, his voice trembling. "What happens now?" Ruth looked back at the grave. Now I start over. The land's gone, but I'm still here. I've been invited somewhere new, a community on the coast, an assisted living place, they call it. But to me, it sounds like freedom." He frowned. "You're leaving?" She nodded. "Tomorrow morning." He was silent for a long time. Then softly, "Can I visit?" Ruth smiled, small, tired, but real. "You won't need an invitation." A single tear slid down his cheek. He looked at her, then at his father's name carved into the stone. "He'd be proud of you," he whispered. She shook her head gently. "No, Ken. He'd be proud of us if we stopped pretending that family only means inheritance." They stood there together in the gray light, mother and son, two broken branches from the same tree. When Ruth finally turned to leave, Ken called out, "Mom?" She paused. He hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you really sell it?" Ruth didn't turn around. Because you can't build anything new, she said, until you burn down what's rotten. She walked down the hill, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. Behind her, the oak tree swayed in the wind, scattering its leaves across the graves like blessings. By the time she reached the road, her heart was steady. The past was buried where it belonged. That night, Ruth packed the last of her things. The check was deposited, the papers filed, the house locked. At dawn, she would leave for the coast to a place where no one would tell her she didn't belong. But as she zipped her suitcase, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. She opened it. A single sentence glowed on the screen. You think it's over? It's not. No name, no number, just silence afterward. Ruth stared at the message for a long time, then set the phone down and whispered to herself, I hope not. I'm just getting started. The bus rolled east before sunrise, cutting through ribbons of fog that clung to the Carolina countryside. Ruth sat by the window, her small suitcase tucked beneath her feet, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The fields she once tended were gone now, sold, signed, sealed, but instead of loss, she felt something like stillness. Outside, the land changed. Forest gave way to open plains, then to the low shimmer of the coast. The first glimpse of the ocean came just after noon, a pale blue stretch beneath a sky finally clearing. Ruth smiled faintly. She hadn't seen the sea since she was a child. When the bus pulled into the small coastal town, a staff member from the Silver Pines Living Center was waiting. Mrs. Sato? The woman asked kindly. Ruth nodded. Just Ruth. They drove along a narrow road lined with magnolia trees until the ocean appeared again, closer this time, framed by sand dunes and the call of distant gulls. The building itself was simple cream walls, wide windows, sunlight pouring through the lobby. The air smelled faintly of salt and lemon polish. Your room faces the water, the attendant said as they rode the elevator. You'll hear the waves at night. Ruth smiled. That's all I need. When she stepped into her room, she stopped short. A soft breeze blew through the balcony door, lifting the white curtains like breath. The sound of the tide rolled in, steady, patient. The bed was neatly made, the walls bare except for one framed photograph of the coast, the kind of image that doesn't demand attention, it just listens. She placed her suitcase on the bed, then opened the balcony door. The air was warm and alive. She closed her eyes and let it fill her lungs. This, she whispered, is what freedom sounds like. She unpacked slowly her husband's photo on the nightstand, a small jar of dried mushrooms on the windowsill, her worn Bible in the drawer. The last thing she took out was Ethan's locket. She held it a moment longer before setting it beside the photo. Later that afternoon, she joined the residents in the common lounge. A few were playing cards, others were watching the news with the volume low. A silver-haired woman waved her over. You're new, the woman said with a bright smile. I'm Lorraine, from Georgia. Ruth, she replied, from nowhere in particular. Lorraine laughed. Then you'll fit right in. They talked over coffee about small things, recipes, gardens, the gossip of who sneaks extra sugar into the morning tea. It was ordinary, almost peaceful. When evening came, Ruth walked alone down the boardwalk that ran behind the residence. The sea air wrapped around her like a promise. Each wave that broke seemed to erase a piece of the past. She reached the edge of the pier and leaned on the railing, watching the horizon. The setting sun painted the ocean in gold and crimson. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, softly, to the wind. I thought revenge would taste sweet, she murmured. But it doesn't. It just tastes real. The wind carried her words away. Behind her, footsteps approached. It was Lorraine holding 2 mugs. Evening tea, she said cheerfully. You look like someone who's seen too much and not enough all at once. Ruth laughed a real, quiet laugh that surprised even her. Maybe both. They sipped in silence as the sun sank lower. When the last light faded, Ruth stood. I think I'm going to like it here, she said. Lorraine nodded. Most of us came here running from something. The trick is learning we were running to something instead. Back in her room, Ruth sat on the edge of her bed and turned on her phone. One new message. From Ken. It read, Mom, Ethan saw your photo. He asked who you were. I told him that's your grandma, the strongest woman I know. Ruth read it twice, then 3 times. Her chest tightened, her vision blurred. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth and let the tears come soft, quiet, overdue. When she finally set the phone down, she whispered, "Thank you." Outside, the waves kept their rhythm. The moon rose, spilling silver light through the balcony door. Ruth lay back on the bed, eyes open, listening to the tide. In the distance, thunder rolled faintly, the start of a summer storm. Ruth smiled to herself, unafraid. She turned her head toward the window, whispering, "Let it rain. I've survived worse." But before she drifted to sleep, her phone buzzed once more. Another message. No name, no number, just 5 words. "You haven't seen the end." Ruth stared at the screen, the sea wind fluttering her curtains like wings. Her lips curved into a quiet, knowing smile. "Maybe not," she said softly, "but I've already begun again." The storm came at midnight. Thunder cracked over the ocean, splitting the sky open with light. Rain fell hard and fast, drumming against the balcony glass, pooling at the edges of the window. But inside, the air felt calm, the kind of stillness that comes right before something shifts forever. Ruth sat upright in bed, the glow of her phone lighting her face. The last message still sat on the screen. "You haven't seen the end." She had almost convinced herself it was spam until another one appeared. "We need to talk. Tomorrow." There was no name, but something about the rhythm of the words, the clipped tone, the lack of punctuation made her gut tighten. It was Ken. She exhaled slowly, setting the phone down on the nightstand. "Tomorrow then," she murmured, "if there's anything left to say." Outside, lightning flashed. For an instant, her reflection appeared in the window, lined, tired, unbroken. She got up, walked to the balcony, and slid open the door. Rain swept across her face, warm and heavy. The sea below churned in gray waves that seemed to rise and collapse in rhythm with her heart. "Let it wash it all away," she whispered to the storm, "every lie, every silence." By morning, the storm had passed. The air smelled of salt and new beginnings. When Ruth came down to breakfast, Lorraine was already there, humming softly as she buttered toast. "Morning, sunshine," she said. "Heard that thunder last night? Thought the world was ending." Ruth smiled faintly. Maybe it was for somebody. The front desk clerk approached her table. "Mrs. Sato, there's someone asking for you. Says he's family." Ruth's heart stilled for a beat. "Where?" "In the courtyard." She nodded, stood, and followed the clerk. Outside, the courtyard glistened with rainwater. The air was fresh, the grass still wet. Ken was standing beneath a palm tree, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, eyes dark from sleeplessness. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ruth said, "You found me." "I shouldn't have had to," Ken replied. His voice was quiet but raw. "You left without saying goodbye." Ruth tilted her head. "You left me standing in a hotel lobby. I guess we're even." He winced, looking down. "Mom, I got your check. You didn't have to send anything." "I didn't," Ruth said. "That was the lawyer. My part's done." He nodded slowly. "So it's true then. The land's gone." "It's light now," Ruth said softly. "It'll grow energy instead of crops. The world changes, Ken. People change. Sometimes you have to burn a field before it can bloom again." He took a step closer. "Melissa left," he said quietly. Ruth blinked. "What?" "She left me. Took Ethan to her parents' house in Atlanta. She said I let everything fall apart." Ruth's voice softened, but her eyes stayed steady. "Maybe she's right. Maybe you did." He looked up, his face breaking. "I'm so tired of being wrong." Ruth sighed. "Then stop being ashamed of where you come from." Ken's throat tightened. "I don't even know where I belong anymore." Ruth reached out and touched his arm. "Then start here. Right here. You still have a name, Ken. You just forgot how to carry it." He swallowed hard, nodding. "I want Ethan to know you. I want him to know all of it. The truth, the mistakes, everything." Ruth smiled faintly. "Then tell him, you don't need my permission." For a long moment, they just stood there, two people trying to bridge the years with silence and forgiveness. The storm had left the sky washed clean, a thin strip of sunlight glinting through the clouds. Ken reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper worn from his hand. "Mom, Dad wrote this. I found it in one of his old boxes." Ruth hesitated, then took it. The handwriting was faint but familiar. She unfolded it slowly, reading aloud. "Ruth, if the world ever pulls you apart from the ones you love, don't fight to stay together. Let go and they'll find their way back." Ruth pressed the paper to her chest, eyes glistening. "He always knew," she whispered. Ken's voice trembled. "I don't deserve you." "No," Ruth said softly. "But you're still my son." She looked out toward the ocean, where waves shimmered under the pale Sunday. "It's strange," she said. "I thought revenge would heal me. It didn't, but it cleared the soil. Now something new can grow." Ken wiped his eyes. "Can I visit you here?" Ruth nodded. "You don't need an invitation anymore." He smiled, small, unsure, but genuine. "Then I'll come back next week. With Ethan." Ruth laughed softly. "Bring sunscreen, he'll burn fast out here." They both smiled, a fragile truce forming between them. The wind picked up again, tugging at her gray hair, carrying the faint scent of salt and earth. When Ken finally walked away, Ruth stood alone for a while, watching the sea. She took the note from her husband and tucked it into the pocket of her sweater, close to her heart. The sky had cleared completely now, blue, endless, forgiving. That night, Ruth sat on her balcony, the ocean humming beneath her. She poured a small glass of sake, raised it to the wind, and said, "To new beginnings." But as she set the glass down, her phone buzzed once more. One new message. No name, no greeting. Just 3 words. "Check your mailbox." Ruth froze. The hall outside her door was dark. Slowly, she stood, heart steady but curious. "All right," she whispered. "Let's see what's left to find." The hallway was quiet, washed in the silver light of the moon. Ruth slipped on her robe, slid her feet into her slippers, and stepped outside her room. The air smelled faintly of sea salt and rain. At the far end of the corridor, the red emergency exit sign cast a soft glow on the row of mailboxes lining the wall. Her heart was steady, not afraid, not anymore, but alert, the way a farmer knows when something's stirring in the dark before dawn. As she approached, the sound of the waves below mixed with the slow hum of the building's generator. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath. Her name was written on the small brass plate, Ruth Sato, Room 8C. Inside the slot, an envelope waited. Cream-colored, handwritten. She pulled it out. No return address. Just her name written in ink she recognized immediately. Ken's handwriting. Her chest tightened. Back in her room, she sat at the small wooden desk by the balcony. The wind tugged gently at the curtains as if urging her to open it. She tore the flaps slowly. A few sheets of paper fell out, along with something heavier, a small flash drive taped inside. Ruth unfolded the letter. "Mom, I found something I need you to see. It's a recording Dad made before he died, not the one you kept. This one was saved on an old drive he left with his attorney. They were supposed to send it to both of us when the farm changed ownership. I never knew it existed until this morning. Please, watch it. You deserve to know everything. Love, Ken." Ruth stared at the page, her throat tight. Her fingers trembled slightly as she peeled the flash drive from the paper. She took her laptop from the drawer, plugged it in, and waited as the screen flickered to life. The file was dated the 14th of March 2017. When she clicked it open, the image appeared shaky, grainy. Her husband, Tom, sitting on the old porch swing, wrapped in a thick sweater, the sun falling over his shoulders. His voice was rough, but steady. "Ruth, Ken, if you're hearing this, it means time ran out faster than I wanted. I don't want this land to divide you. You both worked too hard for it to become a battlefield." He paused, coughing lightly. "Ken, I know you'll want to hold on to it. That's your nature. But listen to your mother. She knows how to start again when the rest of us can't. That's her gift. The farm's just soil. She's the seed." Ruth pressed a hand to her lips. Tom looked into the camera one last time. "And Ruth, when the world tries to take your dignity, you don't fight to get it back. You just live so fully that they can't ignore you anymore." The screen faded to black. Ruth sat in silence. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the ache of loneliness, she felt presence. Her husband's words had crossed years, loss, and silence to reach her. She leaned back in her chair, eyes closed. "You were right again, Tom. You always were." A knock startled her. 3 soft taps on the door. She rose and opened it. Lorraine stood there holding 2 mugs of tea. "Couldn't sleep," Lorraine said. "Thought you might be awake too." Ruth smiled weakly. "Come in." They sat together by the window, the moonlight silvering their faces. Ruth handed her the letter, and Lorraine read it quietly. After a moment, Lorraine whispered, "He loved you. You can feel it in every word." Ruth nodded, her voice steady. "And now I know it wasn't just about land or family. It was about freedom. His, mine, Ken's, all of it." Lorraine smiled softly. "So what will you do now?" Ruth looked out at the sea, where the tide shimmered like glass. "I think I'll plant something again," she said. "Not on soil here." She tapped her chest. "Something that grows where people can't take it." Lorraine raised her mug. "To second chances." Ruth clinked hers gently against it. "To learning how to live." The waves outside rolled steady, unbroken. As Lorraine left for the night, Ruth stayed by the window, thinking the story was over. But when she glanced at her laptop again, she saw there was a second file on the drive, one she hadn't opened. It was labeled simply, "For Ethan." Ruth froze, whispering to herself, "What did you leave for him, Tom?" Her finger hovered over the play button. Then she clicked. The screen flickered. Tom's face appeared again, older, weaker, and he said just one line before the video cut to static. "Tell my grandson where the real inheritance is hidden." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the laptop fan. Ruth stared at the frozen image on the screen, her husband's face caught mid-breath, eyes glinting with the same stubborn kindness she'd fallen in love with half a century ago. Outside, the tide whispered against the pilings, slow and rhythmic, like it was waiting too. She rewound the clip, pressed play again. Tom's voice came through faint but clear. "Tell my grandson where the real inheritance is hidden." Then static. No follow-up, no clue, just the low crackle of old tape and the faint rustle of wind across their porch recorded years ago. Ruth leaned back, exhaling. "Always one more mystery, huh, Tom?" She smiled despite herself. She opened the flash drive folder again, nothing else, just the 2 videos. But something in the second clip bothered her. The background, it wasn't their porch. It looked like the barn, near the west fence. And behind Tom, she could just barely make out a shape on the wall, the wooden cross he'd carved from oak after the tornado of 1993. That cross wasn't just decoration. Tom used to hide things behind it, small keepsakes, notes, photographs. He'd called it the heart beam. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed her phone and called Ken. He answered on the second ring. His voice was groggy, unsure. "Mom, is everything okay?" "I need you to go to the farm," Ruth said. "Right now. To the barn." "What? It's 2 a.m. "Just listen. There's something your father left behind the oak cross on the west wall." Ken hesitated, then sighed. "All right, give me 20 minutes." The line went dead. Ruth paced the room, barefoot on the cool tile, staring out at the moonlit sea. Every wave seemed to echo the same word, wait. Minutes dragged like hours. Then her phone buzzed again. A photo. The barn, its interior lit by Ken's flashlight. The oak cross half pulled away from the wall, and behind it a small metal box covered in dust. Another call. "Mom," Ken said, breathless. "I found it." "Open it," Ruth whispered. The sound of metal scraping. Then silence. Ken's voice came through, shaking. "It's a letter. And a key." Ruth felt her heart hammer. "Read it." There was a pause. Then Ken began. "If you're reading this, it means the land is no longer ours, and that's how it should be. The real inheritance isn't acres or money. It's freedom, the kind that comes from ending the cycle that kept us chained to pride and silence. This key belongs to the safe deposit box at First Bank of Raleigh. Inside, you'll find enough to help Ethan start whatever life he chooses, not the one others expect of him. Remember, love is not ownership. its release. Ken's voice broke. "Mom, he left it for Ethan, not for us." Ruth smiled softly through her tears. "Then he learned faster than we did." Ken was quiet for a long time. Then quietly, "Mom, thank you for not giving up on us." Ruth shook her head. "Don't thank me. Just raise him better than we raised you." She could hear the emotion in his breathing. "I will." They didn't say goodbye. They didn't have to. The line went quiet, both of them sitting in their separate worlds, holding the same truth at last. Ruth closed her laptop and walked out to the balcony. The first light of dawn was beginning to touch the horizon, thin, gold, and merciful. She watched it rise, slow and certain. The storm was gone. The past was quiet. The next afternoon, a small package arrived for Ruth. Inside, a child's drawing, a sun over the sea, a stick figure woman with gray hair, and 3 words written in crooked letters. "I found you, Ethan." Ruth pressed the paper to her heart, eyes filling with tears she no longer hid. She whispered, "So did I." Outside, the waves rolled steady, not erasing the past, but carrying it forward, like a tide that always comes home.